Hello, welcome back to the channel. My name is Julie. I can't sleep tonight. That's something I deal with almost on a regular basis. I can't sleep through the night, and I find myself sitting here in the dark, wondering what to do with myself. Sometimes I crochet, I'll be in my Bible, but other times I'm just like, what do I do? What should I do? But I have an idea. I'm going to read our first chapter of our book read tonight, The Way of the Warrior. I was browsing through some of the first chapter, and I think it's going to be really good. So, sorry, there's a bug flying around my cup. We don't have bugs in our house. It's just a little fly. Okay, let me get my eyes ready and situated. So, grab a snack, grab something to drink, get a cozy blanket, whatever you need to do, because the chapter it's kind of long, but I think I'm a pretty good reader, so I'll try to go as smooth as possible. So the first chapter is titled, The Warrior Fights Only for Peace. The warrior is not ready for battle until they have come to know peace. For all the wars that they have ever been waged from the beginning of time were first born in a person's heart. We have a history of war because our souls are at war. We have conflicts because our hearts are conflicted. Every war, every conflict, every act of violence exists because our souls rage. Our only hope for peace is to win the battle within. Every war against another is a war that should never have been fought. It should have been won long before. It should have been won from within. This is our first battle. The war to end all wars is the battle for the human heart. This is the war we must win. To know peace is the way of the warrior. It is impossible to ignore that God is often associated with wars. Certainly the people of Israel have a history of war, as well as one of faith. We might conclude that the God of Scripture is a God of war. Yet the opposite is true. God is a God for peace. We are the ones who brought war to the human story, and since then, God has been fighting for us to find our way back to peace. Solomon tells us that there was a time for war and a time for peace. Our history betrays us, though. Our past is marked by war, whereas peace has forever eluded us. Sadly, the story of humanity can be marked by the weapons we have forged. From stones to arrows, to swords, to bullets, to missiles, our inventions betray our intentions. An outside observer might say that we are creatures of violence for whom peace is simply the language of poets and philosophers. Yet the way of the warrior is not about refining our skills for war. It is about choosing the path of peace. I have chosen this language, but you may find it at first contrary to the intention of this book. Peace can come only when it is fought for. This is true for any and every kind of peace, whether it's peace on earth, interpersonal peace, or inner peace. It never comes to the passive. In fact, if you choose the way of peace, you will find yourself in a constant struggle and endless battle. The peace we seek must come from within, and this, you will discover, is the greatest of all battles. It was Job who uttered, "What I feared has come upon me, what I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, but only turmoil." I am convinced his words echo in every heart. I have no peace, no quietness, I have no rest, but only turmoil. It is a story that all of us can write. It is the struggle that all of us know, some more profoundly than others. If precedent is an accurate predictor of the future, we should not expect we will ever know a world defined by peace. It is perplexing when I meet people who believe there is no God and yet still believe in peace. After all, peace is an ideal of which we speak, but is something this world has never fully known. The human story is marked by envy, jealousy, greed, violence, and bloodshed. There will never be peace on earth until there is peace in us. This is why the way of the warrior must begin here. To find your strength, you must find your peace. for the path to inner strength is inner peace. This is where our journey begins. The way of the warrior begins with finding the missing peace. P-E-A-C-E. There are certain names that stand out throughout history as beacons of peace. Strangely, when you choose the path of peace in the midst of violence and rage, you are often simply remembered by a single name. For example, Gandhi, Mandela, Teresa, Tutu, Buddha, and of course, Jesus. Although each of them advocated for peace in the midst of violence, it is Jesus alone who claimed to actually be the peace for our souls long for. Jesus lived in a time of turmoil and conflict. He was born in a world where his people were oppressed by a foreign empire. Although we think of Jesus as a man born free, he was actually born a slave. In fact, Jesus was a survivor of an infanticide ordered by a king who feared for his reign. All of Israel lived enslaved by the Roman Empire. Israel belonged to Rome. The Hebrews were the Romans' possession. As a man, Jesus was considered a subject to a Caesar who proclaimed himself a god with the right to rule over the lives of all mankind. If Jesus knew freedom, it was not because of his circumstance. If Jesus knew peace, it was in contrast to the chaos that surrounded him. It is in this context that he spoke to his disciples and said to them, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." Jesus' words must have seemed both profound and perplexing to those who heard them. After all, they expected him to bring peace. Many who believed he was the Messiah thought he would come to deliver them from the Roman Empire. The title Messiah had come to mean something very specific to the Jewish people. They expected that this Messiah would parallel the life of King David. It would be this Messiah that would lead his people to overthrow the greatest empire in the world. This Messiah would become their king, and the fulfillment of the promise would be found in their freedom. The coming of the Messiah would be the end of oppression. The words of Isaiah had been passed on for generations. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. There was a very simple litmus test for the Messiah. If he does not establish peace, he cannot be the Messiah. It is his responsibility to bring them peace. He was the embodiment of true peace, yet this type of peace they had hoped for never came. His words must have seemed bittersweet. He spoke of peace with such certainty in the midst of such chaos that it probably caused many onlookers to assume Jesus was a bit naive. There must have been many who wanted to look at Jesus and say, "As hopeful and poetic as your words may be, you need to get a grip on reality. This is not peace. If you came to set us free, to establish a kingdom of peace, then you are a dismal failure and a grave disappointment to all of us who have been waiting so long for the Messiah to bring about change." No one had quite the courage to speak so bluntly to Jesus, but there couldn't have been anything more frustrating for Jesus' listeners than a declaration of peace when their world was in turmoil. Even today, Jesus' words cut to the very depth of our souls, and he seems to know our thoughts even as he speaks peace into our lives. "I do not give to you as the world gives." It's almost as if in one quick phrase he indicts the history of human violence. The peace he brings will never come to us the way we had hoped or expected. This is not the way of the warrior, only the way of violence. You might find it peculiar that I would describe Jesus as a warrior. After all, he is most commonly known as a man of peace. Yet you cannot properly understand Jesus if you do not grasp that his entire life's purpose was to win the greatest battle of the greatest war that has ever been fought. God stepped into human history to fight for us. He did not hope for peace, he fought for peace. Sometimes the true mission of Jesus is misunderstood because he never carried a physical weapon in his hands. Yet if you want to see the true marks of a warrior, you need not look at the scars on his hands. You need to look at the scars on his hands. In his death and resurrection, Jesus took upon himself all the violence of the world, so he could bring all the world his peace. That is why he is most profoundly and uniquely the warrior of peace. That is why we're pursuing his path. Jesus tells us, "Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." With simplicity and wisdom, he cuts between the two things that steal our peace. For the greatest enemies of the peace within are worry and fear. All around me I find troubled hearts, men and women drowning in worry. We have become so adept at worrying that we have created an endless number of names to describe the nuances. Whether we use the language of stress or anxiety, or find ourselves in the depths of depression or despair, worry is the source of so much of our heart's troubles. Worry projects a negative view of the world around us. Worry projects a negative future. Worry is an act of faith. It is a deep-seated belief in worst-case scenarios. Worry is not rooted in reality, but does affect our reality. I've also found irony in these words of Paul. Be anxious for nothing. I know what that means. I know that what he means is that we should not allow anything to make us anxious. But the truth is that it usually is nothing that is making us anxious. Our anxiety, our distress, our worry, when stripped to its very essence, is rooted in nothing, or at least in nothing we can control. Paul's solution, of course, is to be anxious in nothing, but in all things, through prayer, we should bring about our thanksgiving to God. It seems he's telling us that anxiety comes when we try to control things that are out of our control. We become anxious because we haven't learned to trust. It is interesting that in another place where Jesus speaks of peace, he brings up trouble once more. Here he says to his disciples, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble." This is an important contrast. First he says to us, "Do not let your hearts be troubled," but then he says to us, "In this world you will have trouble." We have no control over the reality that in this world we will have trouble, but we have control over whether we decide to allow our hearts to be troubled. He makes the promise that though there will be trouble in this world, we can take heart, for he has overcome the world. Our worry will steal our peace, and when peace is missing, we find ourselves drowning in anxiety and crumbling under the weight of life's pressures. He also said, "Do not be afraid." If worry wars against our peace, fear is perhaps an even greater foe. When we live our lives afraid, it creates turmoil and chaos within us. Fear is the enemy of peace. While worry will rob our joy, fear will steal our freedom. For what we fear establishes the boundaries of our freedom, and what we fear has mastery over our souls. When we are anxious, we lose our strength. When we are afraid, we lose our courage. When we have found peace, we have both the strength and courage to live the lives we were created to live. Even in my own life, I see the relationship between worry, anxiety, and the inability to control the world around me. Throughout my life, I've had a fear of dogs. Even to this day, I still jump when a dog moves in my direction, even though I love dogs. The root of this fear is not undiagnosable for me. When I was around 5 years old, I saw my brother get bitten by a dog. It could have been either one of us, but as life would have it, he was the one the dog targeted. Oddly enough, my brother, who was actually bitten by the dog, never developed any fear of dogs whatsoever. My fear and anxiety were rooted in what could have happened and not in the reality of what did happen. It was as if for the rest of my life I kept waiting for what I feared to happen, even though to this day I have never been bitten by a dog. For years I was afraid of roller coasters. Again, it was not rooted in something irrational. When I was around 10 years old, the seat belt broke while I was riding a roller coaster, and I held on for my dear life. I remember screaming my guts out trying to get the operator's attention, but he was too busy smoking to notice. I was never thrown off the roller coaster, as I managed to hold on until it finally came to a stop. But out of that negative experience, an enduring fear took over. I spent years watching other people ride roller coasters, but that's exactly what fear and anxiety do to you. They put you on the sideline watching life happen. I couldn't control the variables I got if I got into the roller coaster, so I stayed on solid ground to give me some sense of control. It was years later when I finally determined to overcome that fear. Without fully understanding the complex nature of fear and anxiety, I knew what I had to do was to get on a roller coaster. I had to destroy an ingrained belief that if I got on the roller coaster, I would die. Since that time, I have enjoyed a lifetime of extreme inclines and insane drops. I love roller coasters. I love the feeling that happens when my stomach drops. I love the illusion of free falling and plummeting to my death. Ironically, those two phobias in my life helped me establish a pattern of overcoming fears in multiple arenas. Every fear feels justified. One reason is that every fear has a seed of truth in it. But the thing is that you do not ultimately have control over your life. Peace does not come because you finally have control over your life. Peace comes when you no longer need control. If fear has a direct object, anxiety is fear without an object. We experience anxiety when we feel overwhelmed by life. In order to reduce our anxiety, we often create smaller and smaller boundaries to give us some sense of control over our lives. The warrior's strength is their peace. Jesus did not come to conquer kingdoms or nations. He came to conquer hearts and minds. If you are going to walk in the way of Jesus, you must know that you are to enter darkness that desperately needs the light. In describing the path that John the Baptist would prepare for Jesus of Nazareth, these words were spoken about John at his birth by his father Zechariah. You will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. The path of peace comes only when we're willing to walk into our own darkness and face our own shadows. We must face the very things that steal our peace from us, whether they are born out of fear or our doubts. The concept of peace is deeply rooted in the history that shaped the world and culture of Jesus' day. The Hebrew word for peace is shalom. The word shalom is layered, complex, and elegant in its nuances. At its most superficial level, shalom is basically used as a form of greeting. In many ways, it can be compared with the English word goodbye, which is simply part of our common language but is rooted in the phrase, God be with you. Shalom is a greeting with deep implications. It is most commonly translated and understood to mean peace, but the peace of shalom is rich in its textures. The word extends beyond meaning of peace to meaning harmony, wholeness, completeness, prosperity, welfare, and tranquility. To experience shalom is to find wholeness. When we find peace, we are made whole. The ultimate goal of peace is that we are not only made whole within ourselves, but also become part of the whole within all of creation. The very concept of shalom assumes that the original intention of God is for all things to be interconnected, that when there is peace, there is relationship and harmony between all things. The clearest evidence that we lack peace is that we all sense a tearing between us, a separation that divides us from God, from our true selves, and from others, and yes, even creation. The evidence that peace is missing is the break between us and God, the violence of brother against brother, and our destruction of and irresponsibility with the creation we have been entrusted with. When there is peace, all these relationships are made right, and everything is made whole. When we are broken, we are left with all. When we are broken, we are left. I'm sorry, this sentence is just escaping me. When we are broken, all we are left with are the pieces of our true selves. As much evidence as there is around us that we desperately need to find our peace, there is even deeper proof within us of how peace has eluded us. When our hearts have not found peace, we have become filled with the darkest expression of ourselves. We're filled with not only fear and doubt, but with also greed and envy, anger and bitterness, loneliness and disconnection, despair and hopelessness. Each of these are external forces that war against our inner worlds. We struggle with envy because we want the life that isn't ours. We struggle with greed because we want to possess what is not ours to have. We struggle with feelings of insignificance because we have made our worth dependent on the opinions of others. We struggle with identity because we don't know who we are outside of what we do. We struggle with loneliness because we are searching for love rather than giving it. We will never know peace as long as we are slaves to external forces of the world and create our identities from the outside in. We will never know peace if we lose the present because we are trapped in the past and paralyzed by the future. There is no small part why we live in a culture crippled by depression and anxiety. Depression is rooted in your past. Anxiety is rooted in your imagined future. Depression is how your soul processes regret. Anxiety is how your soul processes fear. Depression traps you in your worst and most painful memories. Anxiety imagines your worst and most painful future. You lose the present when you hide from your past and run from your future. Depression and anxiety convince you that the past is your future, and so the future must be avoided at all costs. Scripture tells us to be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. It was intended for us to be fully present in the moment. Only the present will free you from the past, and only the present will free you to your future. The path of freedom from your past and freedom to your future is the connectedness that comes from living this moment fully present. It may seem strange, but you connect to the transcendent only when you are fully present. When you experience God's presence in the moment becomes eternal. But here right now, be here right now. The path of peace comes not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Here's how Isaiah described the path towards peace. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. This is the path to mindfulness. This is the way of peace, to peace of mind. Not a journey to nothingness, but a journey to fullness. It is God who gives us perfect peace. More specifically, it is Jesus who has come to bring us this peace that our souls long for. John the Baptist was chosen to prepare the way for the coming of Jesus. His mission was to shine on those living in the darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. The last thing anyone would ever say to describe John the Baptist is that he was compliant or even cooperative. John was a nonconformist in every way. His message was confrontational, and his very nature was forceful and powerful. Yet we are told that even his harsh tone and stark language were chosen for our own good. His purpose was to awaken those living in the darkness of all the shadow of death, and show that there is light and life available for all of us. It would be easy to see John as a man of war, yet his sole intent was to guide our feet into the path of peace. Recently I heard my son, Aaron, explain that God goes to war only for the purpose of peace. Remember, John came only to prepare us for Jesus. To follow Jesus is to choose the path of peace. Everywhere he reigns, there is peace. When he was born, the declaration of the angelic beings was glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests. Through the most violent instrument of death the world has ever known, Jesus came to be our peace. Yes, not to simply bring us peace, but to be our peace. When Aaron was in high school, I got a call letting me know that he was in danger of being expelled for getting in a fight. I had never known my son to be violent, so I was a little surprised. But when I discovered what was happening, it made perfect sense to me. Apparently, there was a cluster of kids who were physically abusive to a specific group of outsiders. Their hostility had become an everyday occurrence at Aaron's school. In this particular situation, there was a group of well-off white students bullying underprivileged Hispanic students. One day, Aaron felt he needed to intervene. He jumped into the fray to try to protect a classmate who was outnumbered and overpowered. More often than not, when you attempt to become a peacemaker, you become a target. After that day, Aaron became the focus of some redirected violence and anger. The administration's stance was not helpful. Their advice for Aaron was that because he was the focus of the bully's aggression, he would just need to fight back and defend himself. Yet when I asked what the consequences would be for taking such action, I was told that my son would be expelled if he fought back. You can imagine my confusion and frustration. It's amazing how quickly you can go from peacemaker to having a reputation for violence. This is exactly the dilemma for God, who in the Old Testament is constantly depicted as a God of war and violence. The way it is told, he is both the creator of war and an instigator of violence. The reality is that we are the ones who introduced violence to the human story. We are the ones who carry war in our hearts. God has literally tainted his reputation by determining to bring peace in the midst of our violence. If the world were at peace, God would not disrupt it with war. It is because the world is at war that God disrupts it to bring peace. The only reason God is at war is that he is fighting for us. Yes, God is a warrior. He is a warrior of peace. God will always fight for the good and the beautiful and the true. God is not a God of war. God is a God of peace. When we are at war, we live beneath God's intention for us. The wars of humanity war against God's purpose in this world. The God of peace not sit idly by and watch us destroy each other. He will not lose us in our own violence without a fight. We often blame God for involving himself in the wars of men, yet the reality is that for him to engage in human history, he had to enter into our violence and fight for peace. And peace on earth is worth the fight. Jesus knows the condition of the human heart, and that because of our condition, he would always face conflicts, and there would always be suffering. That we would always face conflicts, and there would always be suffering. He knew the standards of this world had fallen far beneath the intention of the Father for all humanity, so he called us to a new way. He called us to choose peace as our power. Jesus went on to say, "If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well." As if it were not hard enough to choose peace over retaliation, Jesus also wants us to return greed with generosity. It seems that by now we would have learned that violence cannot be ended with violence, but I think few of us have ever realized that only generosity can overcome greed. Many times we feel powerless when someone has taken something from us. It's easy to feel that way. It's easy to feel that the only way to reclaim our power is to take what was lost and even more in return. Yet Jesus calls us to a different way. No one can steal what you freely give away. Live your life with open hands. Give away more than another can take from you. As Jesus told his disciples, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. He challenged them. I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. This was not a call to be powerless, but to find a greater power than returning evil for evil. It takes great strength to turn the other cheek. Turning the other cheek means you took the blunt force trauma of someone's worst and remained standing. This is not the way of the weak. This is the way of the warrior. This is the call to rise above our most primal instincts, Let go of revenge and retaliation, and not be fooled into believing that anger is a source of power. The warrior chooses honor and integrity and will not lower themselves to the standard of those who would bring them down to their level. The imagery of turning the other cheek was abundantly clear to Jesus' first-century Hebrew audience. Often their Roman captors would slap them or strike them to try to elicit an angry response. If any of them actually hit a Roman soldier, it would have cost the captive his life. Only restraint would keep someone from falling into that sort of trap. It takes people a great strength to show restraint, and trust that God will be their protector. However, in addition to withstanding abuse at the Roman soldier's hand, Jesus' listeners had to be wary of their own people. Some of the first-century Hebrews who stood in alliance with the Roman Empire would wrongfully sue their neighbor for the purpose of financial gain. This created further division in a time of great discord and made enemies of their own people. Now Jesus was giving them an unexpected strategy to end the enmity between their own family and friends. Give away more than you're being sued for. This would have been an unheard of strategy. Perhaps the greatest indignity in that day was when a Roman soldier would force a young Hebrew to carry the pack that his horse could easily handle. The Romans often thought of the Hebrews as nothing more than horses or dogs. They were not seen as truly human. Legally, Roman soldiers were empowered to make Hebrews carry their packs for a mile. Afterward, they would release them back to daily activities and humiliation. Jesus gave his listeners an unexpected way to claim their strength, to reclaim their power, to proclaim their freedom. If anyone forces you to carry their pack 1 mile, carry it for 2. Choose service over obligation, servanthood over slavery. If they force you to work, then confound them with a greater wisdom. Never forget that you are always free to do more. The way of peace is not called to pacifism. The way to peace is not a call to powerlessness. The way of peace is a call to know one's power. Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple. The Bible tells us he made a whip out of cords, overturned their tables, and drove them out. He would not allow them to leave with the money they had gained. We rarely think of Jesus as physically imposing. He is most often depicted as a passive idealist rather than a warrior of peace. Yet in the cleansing of the temple, we are reminded that Jesus knew that peace would not come without a battle, and it would not come without a cost. The way of peace is not for the weak or the weak of heart. The warrior knows their power, and they know their greatest weapon is peace. And with as many wars that will ever rage around us, the greatest battle for peace will always be within us. Every battle is fought within. Jesus was never powerless. He was the epitome of controlled strength. Although he was always meek, he was never weak. He knew his power, but he never abused it. The warrior knows that peace does not come from control, but from relinquishing control. Everything in life that you try to control that is outside your control will steal you from your peace. You must choose to take hold of what you can control and let go of what you cannot. You cannot control your circumstances, but you can control your character. You cannot control the actions of others, but you can control the choices you make. You cannot control the outcome, but you can control the process. The battle for peace requires that you both take control and relinquish control. Peace of mind does not come because you have eliminated uncertainty, but because you have clarity about what is important. Peace comes when you stop trying to control the world around you and instead take responsibility for the world within you. Inner peace is interconnected to your confidence in future possibilities. In other words, peace is intimately connected to hope. Peace is lost when you are drowning in worst-case scenarios. Peace of mind is not about certainty, but about hope-filled mystery. The warrior has peace of mind because they know that there is always a way to fight light. to find light. Sorry. The warrior has peace of mind because they know that there is always a way to find light, even in the midst of the greatest darkness. They know that there is always hope to be found, even in despair. Peace can exist in the midst of turmoil only if you believe in the beauty of the future. Peace sees the beauty everywhere. When you walk in peace, you are overwhelmed by the wonder of the universe and the beauty of life. It was December 15th, 2016, when my wife Kim and I sat in a doctor's office and heard him say that I had cancer. In fact, it was while writing my previous book, The Last Arrow, that we received this ominous news. I finished that book wondering if it would be my last. The weight of your words hits you much harder when you know that they may be your last. On January 15th, 2017, I shared publicly for the first time about my personal battle, and I must tell you, it's not an easy fight. It's not easy to fight a private battle in the public eye. It all happened so quickly. For a long time, I had known there was something wrong with me, but it didn't truly feel real until it was diagnosed. It was kind of ironic, if you think about it, that you could have cancer eating away at your body and you're never afraid because you don't know it's there. It is the cancer that is so terrifying, or the knowledge of it. Is it the cancer that is so terrifying, or is it the knowledge of it? You never know how you're going to react. I certainly had no idea that those days would be like, what those days would be like that. Sorry? I certainly had no idea what those days would be like for me. It would be 2 days later, on January 17th, that I would admit to myself to Huntington Memorial Hospital and allow the surgeons to do their best to save my life. I remember sharing with my family that I was giving myself permission to feel whatever I needed to feel. There was no time to pretend and no reason to waste what might be my last days by hiding from my deepest feelings, which would in essence lock out those I loved the most. If you're not honest with yourself, you cannot be honest with anyone else. When we close ourselves off from our inner pain and struggles, we inevitably close ourselves off to everyone in our lives as well. I decided that if I felt anger, I was going to be angry. If I felt afraid, I was going to feel afraid. I was just going to let myself be human. I felt certain it would be okay with God, that He would understand if I fell short of the expectations of others. Yet the strangest thing happened. I never felt anger, I never felt bitterness, and I never felt fear. After all, how could I be angry when I have lived such an extraordinary life? How could I be bitter when I have known far more than my fair share of goodness? Still, with all that, what surprised me most was that I didn't feel afraid. I knew that it would be perfectly acceptable, in fact, expected, to be afraid. I even began to wonder if there was something wrong with me because I didn't feel fear. My greatest discovery in facing cancer was that I had actually come to know peace. And while I can tell you with absolute certainty that the source of that peace was without question Jesus, I would be remiss if I did not also say that the process to finding that peace was not quite that simple. The way of the warrior is in large part the journey toward coming to know that kind of peace. I am convinced that many people have lost their faith in God because they have confused source with process. Yes, God is the source of all peace, and that source is available to all of us freely. The process, though, requires struggle and resilience and does not come without a cost. Now, don't get me wrong, I felt the sadness of the potential loss, not of the loss of my life, but of the things I would not get to share in. I wanted to spend more years with my beautiful wife, Kim. I wanted to watch my son, Aaron, get married one day, hopefully, please God. I wanted to live long enough to watch him flourish and step into the full strength of his gifts of leadership. I wanted to watch his children grow up and bring him immeasurable joy. I wanted to be here to see my daughter Mariah and her husband, Jake, flourish in their careers, watch their music travel across the world, and hopefully one day watch them have kids of their own. There were so many things in this life that I loved, and they would have been hard to say goodbye to. But that's different than fear. Fear is crippling and steals your life from you. Fear is the enemy of peace. The surgery was supposed to last 2 hours, but it lasted more than 6. My surgeon explained that part of what took so long was the extent of the cancer and the unexpected work of removing a large amount of scar tissue from when my appendix had ruptured when I was a young boy. Imagine finding out 46 years after the fact that your appendix had burst when you were 12 years old. All I remember from being that age is turmoil. I remember being completely disconnected from the world around me. I remember my parents not knowing how to help me, found me professional counseling. I remember going in and out of both a psychiatric office and a hospital for a battery of tests that could find nothing wrong with me. They decided to do exploratory surgery. I was told that the cause of my pain was psychosomatic, and in the end, there had been nothing wrong with me. I never knew that 2 surgeries more than 40 years apart would somehow be so interconnected. I spent the better part of 40 years believing there had been nothing wrong with me, that the surgery was a waste of time, that the pain was all in my head. The surgery to remove only my cancer also became the surgery that removed the scar tissue that had been there for more than 4 decades. There was for me a strange irony in learning that there had actually been something physically wrong with me. I had always thought it was only psychological, but it turned out not to be all in my head. I had lived more than 40 years with scars that I didn't know were there. Yet those were not scars that left me damaged. They were much deeper scars that could ever be caused by a surgeon's knife. Somewhere early in my life, way younger than should ever happen to anyone, my soul found itself in disarray. I didn't know when it happened, but early in my life, I lost my peace. Most of my memories of childhood are filled with nightmares, with an overwhelming sense of despair and anxiety. There wasn't really language for it back then, but I was in a fight for my life, as I was drowning in depression and hopelessness. So you cannot know how unexpected it was that in facing cancer, I felt none of those things that I'd felt so profoundly when I was much younger and more fragile. I can tell you that it is more than a theory and more than an aspiration. Not only can you know peace, but you can also be at peace. And while the world around you rages, the world within you can know a strange stillness and an unexpected calm. It was around 9 p.m. when I was finally wheeled into my hospital room to begin my recovery after surgery. The surgical procedure had required that 6 holes pierced the area around my abdomen, while a robot called Da Vinci carved away the cancerous cells and ensured that it left all the healthy organs intact. It was almost precisely 3 hours later, at the stroke of midnight, that I woke up and decided I would take a walk. I woke up my wife and asked her to help me get out of bed. She was uncooperative, but to put it mildly, so I buzzed the nurse and informed her that I was ready to get out of bed and begin the process of rehabilitation. Both my wife and the nurse insisted this was a bad idea, that I had just come out of 6 hours of surgery and needed to give myself time to heal. So I asked the nurse point blank, "Is there really any more damage I could do if I got out of bed and started walking?" She conceded that there was nothing harmful about walking, but it would be terribly painful. So I insisted, and my mind would not be changed. Then the nurse moved to a second strategy. If she couldn't keep me in bed, she at the very least needed to make sure I was medicated. She encouraged me to give her a few moments to get some painkillers into my system so I would not be overwhelmed by the pain. For some reason, my mind was so clear. I looked at her and explained that the whole point was to feel pain, that I would not allow her to give me painkillers. I understood that this might be more pain that I could bear. I went on to explain that I knew that if I could bear this pain, I could bear whatever pain was ahead of me. So reluctantly, the nurse and my wife helped me out of the bed. I stood to my feet, and I think in this case it would be literal to say I wanted to scream my guts out. The first step was unbearable. The second was even worse. The third and fourth steps were unrelenting. The fifth and sixth, unforgiving. I wish I could tell you that God somehow intervened in that moment and made me oblivious to the pain, but if anything, the gift God gave me was to make me more aware of it. I stood in the middle of my pain. I stepped into my pain. I walked through my pain. You see, one thing I was certain of was that the other side of my pain, there awaited my freedom. And I'm going to stop there. And we're going to pick up with the rest of chapter 1 in the next video. I'm at 45 minutes, so I'm getting a little bit sleepy and I don't want to start messing up my words, but I'm really enjoying this so far. I hope you are too. I think this is going to be a really good read. So, okay, y'all take care, and I'll see you on the next video.